Hello and welcome to Lecture 1 of Week 1 of the Social History of War, HST 110. Now during this week then we're going to be looking at the roots of war. We're going to be looking back into prehistory. We're going to be asking the question, is war a kind of natural occurrence? And I'm going to argue that no, it's not. Now there are certain proclivities that we have, certain kind of natural tendencies we have that are very useful in war. Aggression, for example, self-defense is another example. However, it's argued that really war, as we know it today, cannot exist without civilization itself. War has to have a cause, and throughout human history, most of the time that cause has been gaining territory. And up to only probably 3,000 years ago, most societies didn't conceive of private property. And as a result, they didn't fight wars over this. Yes, there were conflicts. Yes, there were fights. But these were not wars. People were not trying to gain territory off each other. So that's really the argument that I'm going to be making in the next two lectures. I'm going to give you these kind of short kind of spoken word lectures, and then you're going to be asked to read the rest of the lecture online. There are lots of images as well that you can click on and see there. The other thing I should say is there will be an assignment for this week. It's a very easy assignment. It'll hopefully just get you kind of working out what to do. What I'm going to ask you to do is listen to my lecture and then read the essays that are online. And I just want to ask you to answer a series of very simple questions on those lectures, just to make sure that you're kind of understanding what I'm trying to say. I expect your answers, as it says on the little rubric, to be short, no more than kind of 3 or 4 sentences each. And I don't expect you to do any more research on these. I just want to kind of get us moving in a very simple fashion. So first off then, let's talk about the origins, the roots of war. Looking back then over the last century, the 20th century, at the tales of civilian massacres, the harrowing photos of screaming orphans, and the black charred bodies of innocent victims, it's tempting then to blame modern man's proclivity for violence on new technology. The rapid fire rifle, the tank, the self-propelled missile, the atomic bomb have all changed the speed with which man can kill man or woman or child. But men invented these instruments of death. Napalm and nerve gas were not dropped into our laps by some malevolent god. We, the human race, put a great deal of effort into producing them because we intended to fight wars with them. It's our attitudes then towards war and our uses for it that really demands our attention. Why did we bother to invent these weapons? Those are the things then have remained. These then are the things that remain unchanged, that provide the permanent framework within which our present technology, organisation and resources have inflated war to the point where it threatens at times to destroy us all. War then is an institution as old and as complicated and as pervasive as, say, religion or laws of property. And to understand why the unchanging things about it have not changed, why every state in the world constantly prepares for war, no matter what its propaganda says, we have to go back to the beginnings of civilization. The soldier then was one of the first inventions of civilization, and he has changed remarkably little over the 10,000 years or so that armies have existed. The teenage recruits then of the Libyan army in 2011, or the doomed British battalions going over the top during the July drive on the Somme in 1916, were taking part in the same act of sacrifice and slaughter that destroyed the young men of Rome at Cannae in 216 BC. The emotions, the odds, and the outcome were fundamentally the same. Battle, the central act of warfare then, is a uniquely event in which ordinary men willingly kill and die as though those extraordinary actions were normal and acceptable. And changing weapons and tactics have not altered these essential elements of its character. War then tends to obey certain innate rules. For example, war has always had an innate tendency to expand to the absolute limit of the resources available to the societies waging it, and sometimes far beyond their capacity. Force then is the ultimate argument, and once it's been invoked, once people have declared war, the only effective reply is superior force. The internal logic then of war has frequently caused it to grow far bigger in scale than the importance of the issue originally in dispute would justify. World War I then is a striking example. Why were millions killed just because a small archduke was shot, was assassinated? The Third World War then will be even less convincing, if there's anyone less to convince. Yet modern societies do not behave any more ruthlessly than their ancestors. The residents then of Dresden or Hiroshima in 1945 suffered no worse fate in many ways than the citizens of Babylon in 680 BC, when the city fell to a man called Sennacherib of Assyria. Sennacherib of Assyria gives us one of the first examples of war atrocities. He actually wrote down, or it was written down on his tomb, he boasted, "I levelled the city and its houses from the foundations to the top. I destroyed them and I consumed them with fire. I tore down and removed the outer and inner walls, the temples and the ziggurats built of brick, and dumped the rubble in the Erutu Canal. And after I had destroyed Babylon, smashed its gods, and massacred its population, I tore up its soil and threw it into the Euphrates so that it was carried by the river down to the sea." It was then perhaps a more labour-intensive method of destruction than nuclear weapons or cluster bombs, but the effects, at least for the individual city and the individuals, was about the same. Everyone was died, the city was razed to the ground. Most then of the major cities of antiquity sooner or later met the same fate as Babylon, when the fortunes of war eventually left them exposed to their enemies. The difference then between the destruction ancient military commanders wrought in war and what the commanders of today's strategic nuclear forces can do in war is determined mainly by their respective technologies and resources, but not by a different mentality. Men still pretty much think the same in war. Today then it's better cluster bombs or heat-seeking missiles, but the search for efficiency was the same. So I'm going to give you an example. The following then are instructions from a Roman soldier's training manual. And there were the instructions then on the use of a sword. And you can see in this quote how the Romans were just as concerned about killing people with the least effort and the least resources possible as modern day generals. And I quote, a slash cut rarely kills, however powerfully delivered, because the vitals are protected by the enemy's weapons and also by his bones. A thrust then, going in 2 inches, however, can be mortal. You must penetrate the vitals to kill a man. Moreover, when a man is slashing the right arm and side, are left exposed. So basically when you cut with a sword, your side is left exposed. When thrusting, however, the body is covered. Thus, when you thrust a sword, your body is basically covered as your side on. And the enemy is wounded before he realises what has happened. So this method of fighting, then, is especially favoured by the Romans. But then, if the willingness, then, of soldiers and the tendency to war to become as destructive as the existing technology and resources will permit have both been relatively constant throughout human history, then we must consider an unwelcome possibility, that war then is the inevitable accompaniment of any human civilization, that sooner or later we will become involved in a war to which all the available technology and resources are committed to the task of destruction. However, if war then is very much part of our history, it's perhaps not part of our prehistory. It's not in our genes, as we'd say today. It's oddly a function of civilization itself. And I'm going to give an example. Only a generation ago then, about 30, 40 years ago, the Walbiri Aborigines of Australia still lived in small bands in a hunting and gathering economy, basically like the entire human race did for at least 98% of its history. And although every male Wabiri was a so-called warrior, their way of fighting did not resemble what we called war. Very few people got killed, there were no leaders, there was no strategy or tactics, and the only kinship group affected by the issue at stake, which was more often revenge for a killing or ritual offence committed by another group, would take part in the fighting. So these weren't fights between entire villages or entire towns or entire societies. They were fights basically between you and your family against another family. The Stone Age societies then that have survived up to the last 50 years or so in Oceania probably have exactly very similar lives to our ancestors in Europe, Asia or the Middle East 10,000 years ago. All probably have the same attitude to war, which is it's an important ritual, an exciting or dangerous game, and perhaps even an opportunity for self-expression. But it's not about power in any recognisable modern sense of the word, and it's certainly not about slaughter. You don't go out to murder the entire family that you're warring against or you're fighting against. So the question that I'm going to be dealing with in the written part of this lecture is, why did things change? How did we go from a society where basically you might fight, you might beat up on another family, to all-out war of one society against another? And that's what I'm going to be dealing with in the written section of the next lecture. Thank you.